Greetings from three parts of the world. We are very lucky today that we are joined by Marleen Dieleman and Andrew Delios from National University of Singapore, Tanvik Kothari from San Jose State University from California, and my name is Naomi Sinkovic. I'm joining today from rainy Glasgow. This is the very first interview in our Vibe interview series that we are calling Paving the Way. And these interviews are related to initiative, experiences, lessons learned, and advice related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today with us, we have Marleen Dieleman. She is Associate Professor of Strategy at NUS Business School in Singapore. She holds a PhD from Leiden University in the Netherlands. She teaches and researches corporate strategy, corporate governance, especially in family business groups in Southeast Asia. She published widely on the topics, including books, articles in academic journals, book chapters, cases, and reports. Her work is featured regularly in international media, such as The Economist or the Financial Times. Marleen won multiple awards for her teaching, and she is a frequently invited speaker. She has worked with various Asian companies as a consultant, workshop facilitator, or board member. Thank you, Marleen, for joining us. And we have Andrew Delios, a professor in and vice dean of MSc programs at NUS Business School. He was head of the Department of Strategy and Policy for 8 years. His research looks at strategy, governance, and global competition in emerging economies, with a particular focus on international business issues for companies operating in East and Southeast Asia. He has authored more than 100 journal articles, case studies, and book chapters, as well as 6 books. He has been editor for several leading journals, and from 2011 to 2013, Andrew served as the president of the Asia Academy of Management, and he became fellow of the Academy of International Business in 2013. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us. So to kick off this interview, can you please briefly share the background and the motivation, the context that triggered your initiative at NUS Business School?
Andrew, go ahead.
No, please, Marleen. Yeah.
I guess what Andrew and I and one other colleague have been involved in championing a diversity journey in NUS Business School. And I think the immediate trigger for it, other than us seeing the issue, was our dean. Because when our dean came, he observed that he saw quite a lot of diversity in our school, but what he was missing was gender diversity among faculty, and especially among senior faculty. So he started the process by commissioning a series of groups or reports and trying to address this issue. So this, I think, set the scene for our work in NUS Business School. Anything to add, Andrew?
Yeah, I would go actually much farther back than that, Marleen, because I know this has been on your radar for a long time. And I think a lot of us also had an idea about what was happening, but never thought too much about it. But then actually Marleen and I stumbled onto a conversation where we showed we were of a similar mind about what was happening within NUS. And we both had profiled the same situation, albeit with different examples. So as part of my class of Asian business environments, which we teach to which we deliver to our master's students, when we were discussing gender issues and how they vary across various Asian markets, I'd profiled an organization that had its 11 senior members with some ethnic diversity, meaning 1/3 were white, 1/3 were Caucasian, 1/3 were East Asian, 1/3 were South Asian, but all were male. And I put it to my students, I said, hey, would you like to work for this organization? And I was actually pretty surprised when I found that not too many of the students were deterred from working in that organization. Maybe at a starting level, but not at a future level. Then subsequently, I show them, hey, this is NUS Business School. And I show them all the photos. And so I relay this to Marleen, and she says, you know what, it's somewhat even more stratified than that. And I said, what do you mean? And she developed an example for NUS as a university, which is more ethnically homogeneous, but still similarly gender concentrated. So I think at that point in time, we kind of both became attuned to this issue, and we began to think about what it is. Now, at that time, I only kind of saw the issue. I didn't know any of the background details, but Marleen obviously knows much more about related literatures, both in academic and cases, as well as practitioner-oriented or consulting-oriented writings, which she subsequently attuned myself and Vivian to when we had to engage in our process. But the phenomenon, I think, both struck us as somewhat odd when we encountered it at different levels at NUS.
Wow, what an amazing story here. With that context and background, I know both of you served on the task force for the initiative. So would it be possible for you to provide an overview of the initiative as to what the process involved and what the recommendations or the outcomes at the point were?
We're both looking at each other, Andrew and
Yes.
I. Andrew, you want to kick off?
Okay, well, we'll alternate. I'll respond to Tandy's questions first. I think one of the first things that we wanted to be assured of and Marleen alluded to this earlier, that our dean was actually committed to the process. Was he doing this on just a rhetorical or a symbolic level, or was he doing it on a substantive level? And I think one thing we can have confidence about with our dean is that he doesn't do anything that he's not serious about. And so I think when he asked us to work on this, I think we felt confident that if we delivered something of substance, he would follow up with it. Prior to our work as well, there'd been another committee that had created a lot of data along a number of different dimensions. And Marleen, I don't remember all the dimensions, but I think they were promotion, recruitment, and so on and so forth. And there might have been 30 or 40 pages of data. This was extremely helpful because when we eventually did surface our recommendations, we had to compact existing perceptions about what is the actual quantitative truth. And so we were able to have this backed up for us. Then subsequently, when we were put to the task of working on the task force, I think Marleen really took charge and guided us in terms of our processes, because she's really attuned to the issues. And at that point, I became more of just following, learning, and trying to support where I could. So Marleen, I think this is a nice point for you to jump in.
Thank you, Andrew. So what we did, Vivian, my other colleague, and myself, was we called some various focus groups of all the female faculty in our school from different departments, different levels. And we simply asked them a lot of questions, and they started to surface a lot of issues, some of which surprised us as well. But these issues later became very powerful narratives. And I think it really changed the game when we shared some of the things they spoke about with the school leadership. So based on the focus group and some other research we did, we came up with a couple of recommendations. And that was the goal of our task force. So I think I pushed quite hard for, I'll share maybe later why, for a recommendation, which was that we should be setting goals and publishing them, and then publicly telling the world how we do towards meeting those goals. In other words, we didn't go for a fixed target or something like that, but we tried to set public goals. So that was one of the issues we came up with. And then after our report, we followed through with various meetings with the school's leadership and took some actions. I have to also say that, you are interviewing us, but I don't necessarily think we are the gold standard. On the contrary, I see it as us being in the beginning of a journey, and us also being able to learn a lot from others. But the journey, in my view, was quite spectacular compared to my expectations. And that's, I guess, why we're sharing it here. Anything to add, Andrew?
I would just echo the very last point. There's lots I could add, but let me just echo the last point. But yeah, it was much beyond my expectations in terms of what we were able to achieve as a commitment from the dean, and particularly getting the targets or these objectives established. This faced a lot of resistance. People misinterpreted targets as quotas. They felt uncertain about the level of commitment required if they set a target, but that's exactly why we want to set a target, because we want some kind of measurable or something to aspire to achieve. And we have to assure people that this is not a be all and end all of the process. In other words, if you don't achieve it, it's problematic. But if you don't achieve it, then that helps us to raise questions about, hey, what happened? Why did we self-impose this target? And then why weren't we able to achieve it? And that can promote some kind of reckoning of where there's failures in our processes.
Yeah, just to add on, I think in general, there are different phases when you go on this diversity and inclusion journey, maybe starting with ignorance and maybe denial and awareness, and then you can come to some sort of understanding, then you can create the diversity, but not do anything with it, right? So you still have to work on equity and inclusion and so on. So I kept on telling Andrew, we're in the pre-awareness phase. So, our job was strong at the beginning of that journey. And I think we've only really addressed the idea of diversity. We haven't even really truly worked on the inclusion aspect. So I think that should be the next step of our journey in NUS Business School.
Thank you. Well, this sounds like a really constructive approach, and I think this will be inspiring for our viewers. Speaking of it, so you both have very international backgrounds, and our viewers, they are also coming from all over the world, just like we are now in 3 different time zones. So to help viewers from different parts of the world understand, are there any aspects that set your particular context apart from any other institution?
Okay, yes, I'll take this one. So I think these kind of journeys always have to be understood in the context, and there's the context of the organization. In our case, and NUS Business School is part of a public Singapore organization, and also the society that you operate in. And I think we are operating in a society where the conversation about diversity is very, very different from what you might find in the US or in Europe. And I'd like to address a couple of issues that are quite relevant here. So one of the elements that we have in Singapore and also in NUS Business School is a very strong sense of meritocracy. So I think that is in general good. Maybe I'll say something a little bit about that later. The other thing is that we live in a culture in our school and in society where there is fairly strict hierarchies, where people have an intuitive sense of where they are in the hierarchy, and there is a great acceptance of that hierarchy. And that could be a bit problematic if that top level of the hierarchy is composed of a certain type of people. And the other thing I would like to briefly touch on is a very Singapore aspect of culture, which is the essence is kiasu. And kiasu is a word that, you don't really want to lose out compared to others. And I think these elements also to some extent shaped the recommendations that we made. At least that's why I started pushing for these targets that were public, because I felt that, it appealed to the kiasu mentality and the ambition level of NUS Business School. And I knew that things like targets are hard to be accepted in a society like Singapore. I've done a lot of work on women on corporate boards in Singapore. For years, I've done, bean counting, how many women are there in the board, and the various advocacy initiatives. And I'd realized that, a very strong approach with quota does not really work well in the Singapore context. So that's one of the reasons why I strongly recommended to go for this public target setting, basically. Andrew? Sure,
thank you. Meritocracy. This is something that is really intriguing to me. And one of the articles that Marleen had found is an experiment, and I can't remember in which journal it's published, but it shows there's actually fallacies in the idea that meritocracies work. And when we were raising the idea about targets, about our situation, about why we have these pronounced gender imbalances that, scissor up in the organization, so to speak, people, our colleagues kept saying, hey, we're meritocratic. And our response was, if we're meritocratic, then how on earth are we in this situation where we've only had 2 female faculty promoted to full professor in the 21 years I've been at NUS? If we're meritocratic, why have I seen situations in our department where extremely qualified faculty who would be tenured in a well, that's not the correct, I was going to say blink of an eye, but that's a snap of a finger, could be tenured in just a snap of a finger elsewhere, face resistance in a supposedly meritocratic process? So what happens is a meritocratic process becomes biased, and there's always room for subjectivity. So the very clear example, I'm sure all of us have heard this at one level or another, is we'll see co-authored papers, and then people will make judgments about what is the relative level of contribution, and I'm sure they're inferred by the names and the supposed genders of the people on these papers. And so I think that's why we have to get away from this, and that's why the targets, first awareness and then targets, are so important. So I think that was one of the things is yes, we promote we suggest we're a meritocratic institution. We've done a lot over our promotion and reward systems in the last 15 years to make it less of a who knows who and more of an explicit reward system based on certain measurables, but that still doesn't always work. Then the other contextual thing in Singapore, which is really intriguing, is that fundamental to Singapore's growth was the increase of the percentage of employable women who were actually working in the workforce. And if we looked at from the days that Singapore was founded in the 60s up until the 1980s and 1990s, the number of people who could work in the workforce who were female increased by 50% from something like 27% to 42% or whatever the number is, or those are the numbers. But paradoxically, we didn't see this filter into the institution. So I think we actually have a decent environment for that, where we have a fairly fair representation of women in the workforce in Singapore. So there shouldn't be any kind of broad cultural level, say, resistance to these ideas. Instead, they're more kind of endemic or systematic biases in the system that lead to some of these problems. And again, that reflects, again, just set those targets and get some kind of better introspection instead of working off invalid perceptions about how you think you're doing things.
Yeah, correct. Just to add on, so Andrew talked about that. It was an ASQ article called "The Paradox of Meritocracy," and they actually found that people who felt that they themselves were meritocratic were more likely to use biases in their selection process. And although the authors speculated that this might be because people don't actually question their judgment that much because they feel they're already meritocratic. So I think that it was very important for us to have that conversation about, if we want more women, are we being less meritocratic, or are we not sufficiently meritocratic in this organization? I think we were able to really change that understanding through the process, because in the beginning, people were in denial, and they said that I've been recruiting for a long time and I'm not biased, I'm meritocratic. It must be somebody else's problem, right? But I think eventually they came around and said that, okay, we realized that there's an issue here, let's fix it. So I thought that was a very, very interesting conversation around this concept of meritocracy.
This is so interesting. I mean, there's so many layers to this conversation that we're looking at. It's not the institution itself, but also the national, and then you bring it, for somebody like me who grew up in Asia. I mean, I can relate to this, but it's still a different context, even within the Asian context that we would put this up. I mean, are there some long-term DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion trends that you foresee, and you assume that will impact not only your grants, but could be impacting other institutions for the future?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical for the organization. And one of the reasons are related to long-term trends. One of the major reasons our dean wanted to support this is he didn't want us to see disadvantage in job markets because of our imbalances in our representations across various demographic characteristics for faculty. And so it's as much as a practical reason as a value-based reason for what we did. But if you ask about DEI, I think if we look at the percentage of new PhD students, and we might even be able to stratify this by discipline, who are male and female, if people evaluate measures themselves in that way, I think the number of junior female faculty is increasing to the point where it's going to be greater than the percentage of men. And as an institution, you can't afford not to participate in that job market in active ways. And one of the, there are many interesting things that came about from the focus group discussions that Marleen and Vivian did. But one of the ones we heard was that there was a sense of some selection away from NUS under the perception that it was unfair or biased in its processes. Now, fortunately, in our most recent round of hiring, actually, we've done really well. I think in terms of in terms of representation, but then that's just the diversity aspect. So we're still thinking about equity and inclusion, and this is really a powerful thing. So with respect to the inclusion, we discovered that a lot of the conversations, very tiny things, but they can be manifest in profoundly powerful outcomes or disparate outcomes. Even something as simple as a conversations over lunch can exclude a faculty and then have spillover effects, like maybe not having access to co-authorships, maybe not having access to resources, maybe not even having access to ideas over lunch, and all of these issues. And that was really surprising to me. I thought in our 21st century institution, in a modern, reasonably modern society, do we still have these conversations that make people feel uncomfortable? I thought we were way past that, but unfortunately we weren't. And I think this is when you Tammy, when you ask this question, I think there's a lot of things that are happening that we just need to really understand and not guard against, just become smarter about it.
Yeah, I think we've only scratched the surface. We've mostly had a conversation about gender diversity so far. I mean, there are a lot of topics that we haven't covered, some of which are very sensitive in our local cultural context. So again, the conversation here is very different from that in Europe or the US. I also see a very big movement towards sustainability, ESG reporting, where this issue might come under the S of that acronym, right? So in the future, I think that will be a basis for competitive advantage. So, I see us integrating these matters in the future and becoming much more broader in our efforts. But having said that, I think we took a few solid steps, and now it's up to us to take the next few steps and just to keep at it, keep walking. Yes.
That gives me the segue for the next question. So if you think back, how would you summarize the lessons learned for the audience? And do you have any word of advice for institutions who are just embarking on this journey?
Yeah, I think, let me just share one small lesson that I had. I was initially, as I said, very pessimistic about the prospects of anything happening from this task force. But I shouldn't have been, because it was much more successful than I anticipated. And one of the reasons, I think, is the power of narratives of people. So even though we had all the numbers, people were still saying, how come these numbers are there? I'm meritocratic. There must be some other reason for those numbers, right? It can't be any kind of bias. But once we showed them the words of the female faculty, how they said that, I was initially reluctant to sign on with NUS because there were no senior faculty who are female in my department, and I wondered why. So once these words came out, people really started thinking about the processes behind it, and I think that was really, really powerful. So never underestimate the power of narratives and stories of people. That would be one lesson I took away. Andrew?
Yeah, so one of them is about any form of organizational changes. When you embark on it, you have to get a coalition, and you have to get a coalition of like-minded people who will be battling a majority as a minority, but if you can include in that coalition, of course, you're someone who has the decision-making power, such as a dean, then you have the opportunity to be able to make change. So I think this is one of the first things we have to think about is use those lessons we know about organizational change, which are more generic, but bring them to this task force. Bring this to this issue. As I mentioned at the outset, by coincidence, happy coincidence or fortunate coincidence, Marleen and I discovered we were kind of interested in similar areas, although my exposure to the topic is nowhere near as deep as Marleen's, but still we were emboldened to act in similar ways, and we got the dean. So that was important.
Yeah.
Then I think the next thing, and Marleen alluded to that, is start the path once you have your coalition and generate awareness. Work really hard to generate awareness and combat aggressively, I would suggest, false arguments or false defenses. And we were able to do so because we had the data from our institution, and we also had the data, or we were informed by prior research and prior experience. And so we're able to combat some of those traditional arguments. And in this situation, I would say you're dealing with arguments that are, for those of you who have children, are like the traditional excuses of children. And not to say our colleagues are children, but the same kind of reasons come up. Why didn't you eat your dinner? Why didn't you do that? And you're going to get the same kind of stock answers. And really, that's what we went through. And you have to be prepared to battle those stock answers because they have a seductively seeming logic to it. But at the end of the day, it's just not a valid argumentation. So that's why you have to be somewhat staunch in your counter argumentation to their argumentation. So those would be the three things I would suggest: coalition, including important decision makers, generating that awareness, and awareness is a massive leap forward, and then being bold enough to take on some of those arguments and try to convince people why those are not valid statements about where you are as you are currently as an organization.
Thank you. Is there anything that we haven't asked, but you think that you would like to add?
I'll speak about my own journey. So over the past 3 years, I've learned a lot about this issue, and obviously there's a lot more. And Marleen, as she says, scratch the surface, but I see it influencing and affecting a number of areas. I'll give you an example. We have a preponderance of young female faculty, young female applicants from China who want to study in our MSc programs. 4 out of every 5 applicants is female, and that struck me as a curiosity. So I started to push during our admission interviews. Why are you applying? I'd say to our young applicants. And then eventually got to the point that I understood that within China, for example, for many hirers, a male plus a BBA is equal to a female plus an MSc. And I thought, how ludicrous is this? So even though China has reasonable gender equity, so we can see there's problems. So the issues are there, and they manifest themselves in many, many different ways, and they affect people very, very substantially. The second issue is that the things we think we're doing to offset some of the impediments to some of the impediments to process or creating equity are not anywhere near substantive enough. So, for example, how much time we accommodate for pregnancy. And NUS used to be, Marleen, I don't know what you received, but was it an hour? Was it a week? Was it a month? It's absolutely ludicrous. But I think as institutions, we have to be prepared for accepting that this can create a two-year what can you say? A 2-year gap or whatever. We totally underestimate, I guess, the time costs to bearing children. And that could be from the paternal side or maternal side. And I think as organizations, we need to be a lot more proactive. And I see this directly in 2 faculty we hired, and their paths are dramatically different. And part of that is the fact that one of them was a faculty who had children, the other one's a faculty who didn't. And so, it's really, really remarkable to see these equally qualified and adept individuals be affected by this process. So as organizations, we need to, I think, we repeatedly underestimate the costs associated with these major life events. And in Asia, this is particularly profound. And I think for organizations in Asia, particularly academic institutions who are competing in global markets, if they don't address this issue, then it will negatively impact their recruiting and performance. And I could go on. There's other things that as you become aware of these issues, you begin to see things in slightly different ways and begin to really understand where your weaknesses are as individuals and as organizations.
Yeah, I guess the lesson learned is that business schools are just like the ordinary organizations we study in international business. We need to pay far more attention to environmental changes, and we need to put far more effort into internal cultural change to keep up. But when you do that and when you do innovate, I think it can become a competitive advantage for an organization. So that's kind of my motivation to keep on walking on the journey and putting in some time and trying to push here and there with our colleagues like Andrew as allies. Because alone it doesn't work, but together you can make a difference.
What a profound conversation and an inspirational experience that you guys both could share here. On behalf of Wade, I would like to thank you both for taking the time to talk to us today and to share your experiences. And for our audience at Wave, I'm sure this is a great learning experience. As Marleen alluded, it's just the beginning of the journey, I'm sure for many of us. And I'm sure our listeners at other institutions across the globe have a lot of takeaways from your experiences at NUS, but it's also important that you made us realize that it's a process, not just the outcome that all of us need to focus. And it's a lot of layers that we all need to focus on organizationally, societally, and at many levels. Andrew, you've started a wonderful dialogue by chairing the upcoming AIB conference with the Beyond Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity and Fairness in International Business theme. And we're all excited for that. On Wade's end, I would like to highlight that our efforts are guided by three main priorities: providing a forum for network for among Wade members, facilitating academic mentorships, and promoting research on gender and gender-related issues in international business. So we really hope with this conversation and series of conversations that are upcoming, this is going to initiate a wonderful dialogue between NUS and our members at Wave, and we encourage our listeners that they connect with you, whether it is to offer mentorship to members at your end, or to solicit feedback on how they would implement such initiatives at their organization. So thank you so much for your time, both of you, and sharing this with us today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.